The hum of the engines blended with the quiet elegance of the first-class cabin. The soft glow of ambient lighting reflected off plush leather seats and polished wood accents. Malcolm Hayes sat by the window, his tailored suit fitting perfectly against the seat's contours. He adjusted his cufflinks casually, his demeanor calm but observant. Across the aisle, Victoria Langford shifted in her seat. Her designer scarf was perfectly draped over her shoulders, and her manicured nails tapped lightly against the armrest. She glanced at Malcolm, her gaze lingering longer than necessary. The flight attendant approached with a tray of champagne flutes, her smile professional but slightly strained. "Would you care for a drink, sir?" she asked Malcolm politely. Malcolm nodded, his voice smooth. "Thank you." Victoria accepted a glass as well, but her movements were sharper, deliberate. She took a sip and glanced at Malcolm again, her lips tightening slightly as she watched him settle into his seat. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional rustle of newspapers and the faint clinking of glasses. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. Victoria's eyes darted to him once more, suspicion etched into her expression like a shadow she couldn't shake. The tension was subtle but palpable, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What is he doing here? The silence in the cabin was broken by the sharp click of Victoria Langford's heels as she stood abruptly. Her movements were precise, calculated, as she stepped into the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying an edge that sliced through the quiet. She turned to Malcolm, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This seat is reserved for premium passengers." Malcolm looked up from his book, his expression calm and unbothered. He raised a single eyebrow as if to say, "And?" Victoria crossed her arms, her tone firm but laced with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong section." The murmur of passengers nearby grew faintly louder, but no one dared intervene. A man in a business suit glanced over briefly, before burying his face in a newspaper. Malcolm closed his book slowly, placing it neatly on the tray table. His voice was steady, deliberate. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Victoria's lips tightened into a thin line. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "I doubt that," she said curtly. The flight attendant appeared at the edge of the aisle, her expression uncertain as she approached cautiously. "Is there a problem here?" Victoria turned to her sharply. "Yes, there is. This gentleman seems to think he belongs in this section." Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease, his gaze never leaving hers. "I wasn't aware my presence required your approval," he replied calmly. The tension thickened as Victoria straightened her posture, clearly expecting compliance. But Malcolm didn't move an inch. The hum of the engines filled the silence. That followed, louder now than it had been moments ago. Victoria Langford's cheeks flushed slightly, but her tone remained sharp as she leaned closer to Malcolm. "I've flown with this airline for years," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "I know who belongs here." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unwavering. "Do you?" Her scoff was audible, a sound that cut through the cabin like a blade. "Yes, I do, and I think it's clear you're in the wrong seat." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably at the edge of the aisle, her eyes darting between them. A few passengers exchanged glances, but quickly turned away, pretending to be engrossed in their magazines or tablets. Malcolm exhaled softly, leaning back in his seat. "You seem very certain of what you don't know," he said evenly, his words measured but pointed. Victoria's laugh was cold, almost mocking. "I know this airline values its real customers," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention from nearby seats. Malcolm's gaze didn't falter. "You're right," he replied, his tone steady. "It does." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on everyone in the cabin. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated when she saw the calm confidence in Malcolm's eyes. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face before she quickly masked it with indignation. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their silence complicit as they avoided eye contact with either of them. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the space where words had failed to land. The cabin felt frozen, suspended in a silence that was louder than any argument. Victoria Langford stood stiffly in the aisle, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze bore into Malcolm Hayes, but he didn't flinch. He sat calmly, his hands resting on the armrests, his presence unshaken. A child peeked over the seat behind them, curious about the tension, but their mother gently pulled them back down. The flight attendant lingered nearby, her posture awkward, as she tried to decide whether to intervene. Victoria's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time. "Are you going to move or not?" Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks slowly, his movements deliberate and composed. "I don't believe I will," he replied evenly. Victoria's nostrils flared as she glanced around the cabin, searching for support. Her eyes landed on a man in a business suit seated a few rows away. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze before pretending to focus on his tablet screen. The flight attendant cleared her throat softly. "Ma'am," she began tentatively, "perhaps we could—" Victoria turned sharply toward her. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped, her tone icy and dismissive. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "It concerns everyone when someone assumes they know where others belong." Victoria's posture stiffened further, but she didn't respond immediately. The other passengers avoided eye contact entirely, their discomfort palpable as they shifted. In their seats, or pretended to read, the hum of the engines filled the room again, louder now than before. Malcolm leaned back in his seat and glanced out the window at the clouds passing by, unbothered by the storm brewing beside him. Malcolm Hayes exhaled slowly and stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, as his full height commanded the space. Victoria Langford stepped back instinctively, her confidence faltering for the first time. "You're mistaken," Malcolm said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm exactly where I belong." Victoria blinked, her mouth opening slightly before she managed to stammer. "Excuse me?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "This seat, this section, this airline, it all belongs to me." The words landed like a thunderclap. The flight attendant froze mid-step, her eyes widening in shock. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen suddenly looked up, their curiosity overtaking their discomfort. Victoria let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head as if trying to dismiss what she'd just heard. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't possibly—" Malcolm turned to the flight attendant, his tone steady but firm. "Would you care to confirm my identity?" The attendant straightened immediately, her professional demeanor returning in an instant. "Mr. Hayes is the CEO of Skyreach Airlines," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin. A ripple of murmurs swept through the passengers. Victoria's face drained of color as she stared at Malcolm, her composure crumbling under the weight of realization. Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of a nearby seat for support. Malcolm adjusted his jacket and sat back down, his movements as composed as ever. He glanced at Victoria one last time before speaking calmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." The cabin fell into a stunned silence. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines as the power dynamic shifted, completely. The room was small and dimly lit, its walls bare except for a single calendar pinned crookedly near the desk. Malcolm Hayes sat hunched over, his elbows resting on the worn wooden surface, a pile of rejection letters stacked neatly beside him. Each envelope bore the same sterile phrasing. "Thank you for your application, but we've chosen a more suitable candidate." Malcolm picked up the latest one, his fingers brushing against the crisp paper as he unfolded it. The words were familiar now, almost predictable. "While your qualifications are impressive, we regret informing you." He didn't bother reading the rest. He exhaled slowly and placed the letter on top of the pile. His gaze lingered on it for a moment before shifting to the window. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars honking, people rushing past. But inside, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just one rejection. It was dozens. Each one felt like a door slamming shut, a reminder that this world wasn't built for people like me. Malcolm reached for his notebook, flipping through pages filled with sketches and ideas, blueprints for an aviation company that could redefine the industry. His pen hovered over a blank page as doubt crept in. The camera zoomed in on his face as he whispered to himself, "They don't see it yet." A knock at the door broke his concentration. His landlord stood in the hallway holding an overdue rent notice. Malcolm nodded silently and closed the door without a word. He sat back down at his desk and stared at the pile of letters again. His jaw tightened as he muttered under his breath, "One day they'll regret underestimating me." The scene ended with Malcolm picking up his pen again, determination flickering in his eyes. The office was dimly lit, the blinds half drawn to block out the afternoon sun. Malcolm Hayes sat across from his mentor, Arthur Sinclair, a seasoned aviation executive whose graying hair and lined face spoke of decades in the industry. The room smelled faintly of coffee and leather, its walls adorned with framed photos of aircraft and certificates of achievement. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He studied Malcolm for a long moment, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "You're smart, Malcolm," he began, his voice measured. "You've got ambition, ideas, but this industry isn't built for people like us." Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He waited, letting the words sink in. Arthur sighed and gestured toward the window behind him. "Look out there," he said quietly. "You see those planes? You see who owns them, who runs the companies? It's not people like you or me." Malcolm glanced at the window briefly before turning back to Arthur. His voice was calm but firm when he replied, "Then I'll rebuild it." Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "I admire your determination," he said carefully. "But this industry, it doesn't change easily. You'll face doors slammed in your face, ideas stolen, people doubting you at every turn." Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "I know," he said simply. Arthur exhaled deeply and sat back again. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, Arthur nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his eyes. "If anyone can do it," he said quietly, "it's you." Malcolm stood and shook Arthur's hand firmly before leaving the office without another word. As the door closed behind him, Arthur stared at the empty chair for a moment longer before muttering under his breath, "I hope you prove me wrong." The networking event buzzed with energy, the room filled with the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter. Malcolm Hayes stood near the edge of the crowd, his notebook tucked under his arm as he observed the room. Executives mingled in tailored suits, their conversations punctuated by nods and handshakes. At the podium, a young man named Daniel Cross, one of Malcolm's peers, adjusted his tie nervously before beginning his presentation. Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly as Daniel spoke. The words were familiar, too familiar. "As we look to the future of private aviation," Daniel said confidently, "we need to focus on accessibility without compromising luxury. Imagine a service that combines efficiency with exclusivity, opening doors to a broader clientele while maintaining premium standards." Malcolm's chest tightened as he realized Daniel was presenting an idea strikingly similar to one he had shared in confidence weeks earlier during a brainstorming session. The phrasing, the structure, it was all his. The camera lingered on Malcolm's face as he whispered to himself, "He took it." The audience erupted into applause as Daniel concluded his speech, smiling broadly as executives approached him with compliments and business cards. Malcolm stayed rooted in place, his grip tightening around his notebook. It wasn't just about losing credit, it was about being invisible in a room where my ideas were seen, but I wasn't. Daniel caught Malcolm's eye across the room and hesitated for a moment before offering a sheepish smile. Malcolm didn't return it. Instead, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps steady but heavy with frustration. Outside, Malcolm leaned against a railing overlooking the city skyline. He opened his notebook and stared at the sketches and notes that had once felt full of promise. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath, "They can take my ideas, but they can't take my vision. The scene ended with Malcolm closing the notebook firmly and walking away into the night. The first-class cabin was quiet, the tension from the earlier confrontation still lingering in the air. Malcolm Hayes sat calmly in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. Across the aisle, Victoria Langford sat rigidly, her face pale but her jaw set in defiance. A few rows back, a passenger discreetly held up their phone, the camera lens peeking just over the edge of their seat. They had captured everything. The sharpness in Victoria's voice, the calm precision in Malcolm's responses, and finally, the moment that left the cabin stunned. "I own this airline." The video was uploaded within minutes. The caption read, "When privilege meets reality, CEO shuts down entitlement mid-flight." By the time the plane landed, the clip had already begun to spread. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared on social media platforms, dissected by influencers, and debated in comment sections. It wasn't just a video. It was a mirror, held up to a system that had gone unchecked for too long. Clips of Victoria's sneering face were juxtaposed with Malcolm's calm declaration. The contrast was stark, arrogance unraveling against quiet dignity. Hashtags like "Nashu Sky Reach," "Justice," and "Mashir Privilege Exposed" trended globally. Comments poured in. "This is what accountability looks like. How many people has she treated like this before?" Malcolm Hayes is a class act. Victoria sat alone in her hotel room that night, scrolling through her phone as her name trended online. Each comment felt like a blow. "She's exactly what's wrong with this industry. Time to clean house." Her hands trembled as she locked her phone and stared blankly at the wall. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in his office at Skyreach headquarters, watching the clip play on his laptop. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. His voice was calm as he muttered to himself, "Let them see." The scene ended with the clip replaying one last time. "I own this airline." The clip had become unavoidable. It played on news channels, was dissected in online forums, and dominated social media feeds. In living rooms, cafes, and offices, people leaned in closer to their screens, watching the confrontation unfold. Yes, a brightly lit newsroom. Two anchors sat at a polished desk, their faces serious as they discussed the viral moment. A still image of Victoria Langford mid-sneer and Malcolm Hayes seated calmly played on the screen behind them. "This video has sparked outrage," the first anchor began. "But is this an isolated incident or part of a deeper issue within the aviation industry?" The second anchor hesitated before responding. "It's hard to ignore the patterns when you look closely," she said carefully. "Complaints about discrimination in luxury industries aren't new." The camera cut to clips of passengers sharing their experiences online. A black woman recounting being denied an upgrade despite having elite status. A former employee describing how her concerns about biased treatment were dismissed as misunderstandings. A passenger whispered into her phone, "I've seen this happen before, just never caught on camera." What started as one moment became a catalyst for voices that had been silenced for too long. In boardrooms, executives exchanged uneasy glances as they reviewed reports of past complaints that had been swept under the rug. At airports, employees whispered amongst themselves, their words carrying a mix of fear and quiet hope. Maybe things will finally change. Back in her home, Victoria sat on her couch, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. She scrolled through headlines that named her directly. "Entitlement exposed. The face of Skyreach's reckoning." Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, the weight of public judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. Meanwhile, Malcolm watched a news segment from his office. The anchor's words echoed through the room. "This isn't just about one seat. It's about who gets to feel like they belong." Malcolm nodded slightly, his expression calm but resolute. The interview room was stark and quiet, its walls bare except for a clock ticking softly in the background. Rachel Patel, a former employee of Skyreach Airlines, sat at the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her uniform was long gone, replaced by a simple blouse and jeans, but the memories of her time at the airline lingered like shadows she couldn't shake. Across from her, an investigator slid a recorder across the table. "Whenever you're ready," he said gently, his tone careful not to push. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting to the recorder before looking down at her hands. "I don't know if it'll make a difference," she said softly, almost to herself. "It will," the investigator replied firmly. "Your story matters." She exhaled shakily and nodded. "Victoria, she's always been like this," Rachel began, her voice trembling slightly. "Mocking accents, ignoring complaints, acting like anyone who didn't look or sound like her didn't belong there." The investigator leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but neutral. "Did you ever report her behavior?" Rachel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I tried once," she said quietly. "I told my supervisor after she called me the help in front of passengers." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she steadied herself quickly. "They told me not to take it personally, that she was just stressed." The room fell silent except for the ticking clock. Rachel's eyes glistened as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody cared until now." Her words hung in the air like an indictment, heavy and unshakable. The investigator nodded slowly and stopped the recorder. As Rachel stood to leave, she glanced back at him and said softly, "I just hope someone finally listens this time." The camera lingered on the empty chair after she left, her words echoing. In the stillness, the conference room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint shuffle of papers as investigators sifted through stacks of documents. The air was heavy with anticipation, each folder opened revealing more of the story no one wanted to admit had been there all along. One investigator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, paused as he pulled out a memo stamped "Confidential." His brow furrowed as he read aloud, "Client comfort must always take priority over unnecessary escalations." He looked up at his colleague, his voice laced with disbelief. "Unnecessary escalations? That's what they called complaints?" Another investigator leaned over, scanning the memo. "Look at the signature," she said quietly. At the bottom of the page, Victoria Langford's name was scrawled in bold ink. The room fell silent for a moment before another folder was opened. This one contained a list of complaints filed by employees and customers over several years. The patterns were undeniable. A black passenger denied service because her ID was too worn. A Latina employee reprimanded for speaking Spanish in the break room. Multiple reports of Victoria mocking accents and dismissing grievances outright. Every single one of these was marked as resolved, another investigator said, her tone sharp with frustration. She held up a document stamped with the word "dismissed." Resolved by ignoring them, the camera panned to a whiteboard where phrases like client comfort and reputation management were scrawled in red marker, connecting dots between policies that had protected Victoria and silenced everyone else. One investigator leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "This wasn't just her," he said grimly. "This was the whole system." The room grew quiet again as they stared at the growing pile of evidence. Outside the glass walls, the faint sound of protesters chanting "Justice now" filtered into the room, their voices growing louder with every passing moment. Victoria Langford sat alone in her living room, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her pale face. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the endless barrage of notifications. Her name was everywhere, on news articles, social media posts, and viral videos. The hashtags were relentless. County Skyreach Justice, Privilege Exposed, Accountability Now. Each click opened a floodgate of comments, all aimed squarely at her. "She's exactly what's wrong with this industry. How many people has she treated like this before? Time for change, starting with her." Victoria's breath hitched as she read one particularly biting comment. "Entitlement doesn't fly anymore." She locked her phone and set it down on the coffee table, her chest tightening as she stared blankly at the wall. For years, privilege had protected her. It shielded her from consequences, silenced complaints, and erased accountability. But now the world was watching, and it wasn't looking away. On television, a news anchor dissected the viral clip with sharp precision. The screen displayed a freeze frame of Victoria mid-sneer and Malcolm Hayes seated calmly across from her. "This video has sparked a global conversation," the anchor said. "It's no longer just about one incident, it's about systemic bias in luxury industries." Victoria reached for the remote and turned off the TV abruptly. The room plunged into silence, but the sound of protesters chanting outside filtered faintly through the windows. "Justice now! Equity always!" She stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to see the crowd gathered near Skyreach headquarters. Their signs were bold and unforgiving. "Accountability starts here. Privilege ends today. Victoria." Let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, her shoulders slumping under the weight of public judgment. She glanced at her phone again but didn't pick it up this time. Instead, she sank into the couch, staring into nothingness as her name continued to trend. Victoria Langford sat at the edge of her bed, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The screen displayed a list of contacts, names she had relied on for years, people who had always been there for her. She hesitated before pressing the call button for Margaret, one of her oldest friends. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it went to voicemail. Victoria's voice cracked as she began to leave a message. "Margaret, it's me. I need to talk." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing how hollow her words sounded. She hung up without finishing and stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She tried another contact. Rachel, a colleague she had once mentored. The text she sent was simple. "Can we talk?" Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, Rachel replied with a curt message, "I can't be associated with this right now." Victoria's fingers trembled as she reread the message, each word cutting deeper than the last. She tried one more name, Charles, an executive she had worked closely with, but his response was even colder. "I think it's best we keep our distance for now." The silence in the room was suffocating as Victoria set her phone down on the nightstand. For years these people had been part of her world, her network, her safety net. But now they were stepping away, one by one. She glanced at a framed photo on her dresser, a picture of herself at a gala surrounded by smiling faces. Those same faces now seemed unreachable, their smiles replaced by avoidance and judgment. Victoria sank into the bed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of rejection. The world she had built around herself was crumbling, and for the first time she felt truly alone. The dining room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel amplified. Victoria Langford sat at the long oak table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea she hadn't touched. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a muted gray light. Her husband, Edward, entered the room slowly, his footsteps deliberate. He carried 2 small cards in his hand, membership cards from the exclusive country club they had frequented for years. Without saying a word, he placed them on the table in front of her. Victoria frowned slightly, her voice hesitant. "What's this?" Edward pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I've canceled our memberships," he said quietly. Her breath caught for a moment. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but distant. "You know why," he replied simply. Victoria's grip on her teacup tightened as she searched his face for something, understanding, reassurance, anything, but found nothing. "Edward, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "That's the problem, isn't it? You never mean it, but it happens anyway." Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. The weight of his words hung heavy between them. Edward stood abruptly and pushed the chair back under the table. "I need some space," he said, his tone final. He turned and walked toward the door without looking back. "Edward?" "Victoria," called after him weakly, but he didn't stop. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a punctuation mark on their conversation. Victoria stared at the membership cards on the table, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. For years she had relied on Edward's quiet support, but now even that was slipping away. Victoria Langford sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. The screen glowed faintly in the dimly lit study, displaying her email inbox. She scrolled, through it slowly, her movements mechanical. The once busy inbox, always brimming with invitations to exclusive galas, charity events, and networking dinners, was now conspicuously empty. Her eyes lingered on the last invitation she had received, a formal black-tie gala from 3 weeks ago. She clicked on it, rereading the details she had once taken for granted. "We look forward to seeing you there." The words now felt mocking. She refreshed the page for the third time in 10 minutes, hoping for something new to appear. Nothing did. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. She picked up her phone and opened her social media feed. Photos from events she would have attended filled the screen. Familiar faces dressed in designer gowns and tuxedos, glasses raised in celebration. Her chest tightened as she recognized Margaret, Charles, and several others she had once considered close friends. They stood together in a photo, smiling brightly under glittering chandeliers. The caption read, "A night to remember with the best company." Victoria's thumb hovered over the like button before she locked the screen and set the phone down abruptly. She turned back to her laptop and opened her calendar app. The dates ahead were blank. No meetings, no events, no reminders of a life she had once commanded effortlessly. The emptiness stared back at her like an accusation. For years, Victoria had been at the center of every room, every conversation that mattered. Now it was as if she no longer existed. The world she had built around herself was moving on without her, and for the first time, she realized how fragile it had always been. The interview room was quiet, the faint hum of a camera recording in the background. Malcolm Hayes sat across from a journalist, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture calm but commanding. The journalist, a young woman with sharp eyes and a notebook balanced on her knee, leaned forward slightly. "This incident has sparked a global conversation," she began, her voice steady but probing. "Do you think this is just about one person, or is it bigger than that?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver as he considered her question. "It's always bigger than one person," he said evenly. "This isn't just about Victoria Langford. It's about dismantling a system that protects people like her." The journalist nodded slowly, scribbling his words down before pausing. She glanced at him carefully, as though deciding whether to say what was on her mind. Finally, she leaned closer and whispered, "Do you think they'll listen this time?" Malcolm's lips curved into a faint smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet determination. "They don't have a choice anymore," he replied calmly. The camera zoomed in on the journalist's face as she absorbed his words. She sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she wrote down his response in bold letters. "They don't have a choice anymore." Hours later, the interview aired on primetime television. Malcolm's words echoed across living rooms and offices. "This isn't just about one person. It's about dismantling a system." Social media erupted with reactions. "This is the change we've been waiting for. Finally, someone speaking truth to power. Malcolm Hayes is leading the movement we need." In her home, Victoria Langford watched the interview in silence. Malcolm's calm voice filled the room as she sank deeper into her chair. His words weren't loud or angry. They were precise, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The press room buzzed with restless energy, cameras flashing incessantly as reporters jostled for position. The air crackled with anticipation, the tension palpable. Malcolm Hayes entered the room, his legal team flanking him like sentinels. His tailored suit was immaculate, his stride steady and deliberate. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone commanded attention, The reporters leaned forward, pens poised and microphones ready. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with expectation. Malcolm approached the podium, adjusted the microphone slightly, and scanned the room. His gaze was calm but piercing, silencing even the most eager voices before they could speak. In the back row, Victoria Langford sat slumped in her chair, her oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes. Her once polished image was gone, replaced by a plain sweater and an aura of defeat that weighed heavily on her posture. She shifted uncomfortably as Malcolm's gaze swept past her without acknowledgement. The room seemed to hold its breath as Malcolm began to speak. "This isn't about one incident," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about what this incident represents, a system that has protected privilege at the expense of equity for far too long." The reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against notepads as cameras zoomed in on Malcolm's composed face. Victoria shrank further into her seat, her hands gripping the edges of her chair, as if bracing herself against the weight of his words. Malcolm paused briefly, letting the silence amplify his message before continuing. "Accountability isn't optional, it's essential." The room erupted into murmurs and flashes of light as reporters scrambled to capture every word. Victoria remained frozen in her seat, her head bowed slightly as the world around her shifted irrevocably. Victoria Langford sank deeper into her chair, her oversized sunglasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. She adjusted them quickly, her movements sharp and nervous. The plain hoodie she wore felt suffocating, but she couldn't bring herself to remove it. She was trying to disappear, but the weight of 100 eyes in the room made it impossible. No one acknowledged her. Not the reporters, not the attendees, not even the security guards stationed near the exits. It was as if she had become invisible, in a world where she had once commanded attention effortlessly. Malcolm Hayes stood at the podium, his presence calm but commanding. His voice filled the room, steady and deliberate. "For years, privilege has dictated who gets to feel like they belong," he said. "It's time for that to change." Victoria flinched slightly at his words, her fingers tightening around her phone. She glanced around the room cautiously, scanning the faces of those who had once been part of her world, executives she had mingled with at galas, reporters who had quoted her in glowing profiles. None of them looked her way now. A reporter leaned toward Malcolm, his microphone held tightly in his hand. "Do you think this moment will lead to real change?" he asked hesitantly. Malcolm's gaze swept across the room before landing on Victoria, for a brief moment. His voice remained calm as he replied, "Change doesn't happen unless we stop protecting those who benefit from injustice." Victoria's breath hitched audibly as murmurs rippled through the crowd. She pulled her hoodie tighter around herself, trying to shield herself from the judgment that seemed to radiate from every corner of the room. The camera lingered on Victoria's trembling hands before cutting back to Malcolm's composed face. At the podium, the room was alive with murmurs, reporters whispering and exchanging glances as Malcolm Hayes stood at the podium, his presence steady and unyielding. The tension hung thick in the air, every word he spoke carrying the weight of years of systemic neglect. Near the center of the room, a reporter stood abruptly, his microphone held tightly in his hand. His voice cut through the murmurs like a sharp blade. "Critics say this is just a publicity stunt," he began, his tone probing but cautious. "How do you respond to claims that this incident has been blown out of proportion?" The question sent a ripple through the crowd. Pens paused mid-scratch, cameras zoomed in closer, and all eyes turned to Malcolm. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements deliberate as he let the silence stretch just long enough to command attention. Victoria Langford froze in her seat at the back of the room, her grip on her phone tightened as her breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of Malcolm's gaze sweep across the room before landing briefly on her, piercing through the layers of her carefully constructed defenses. Malcolm's voice broke the silence, calm but sharp enough to cut through any doubt. "This isn't about one seat," he said evenly. "It's about who gets to feel like they belong." The words landed heavily, their impact reverberating through the room. The reporter nodded slowly, scribbling furiously in his notebook as murmurs erupted once again among the crowd. Victoria's chest tightened as she felt every word hit her like a blow. She glanced down at her phone screen, its glow illuminating her pale face as notifications continued to flood in, each one another reminder of how far she had fallen. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering as he added, "Accountability isn't harsh, it's necessary." The camera lingered on Victoria's bowed head before cutting back to Malcolm's composed expression. Victoria Langford's phone buzzed in her lap, the vibration rattling against the hard plastic of her chair. She hesitated before glancing down at the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked it. The notification read, "Victoria Langford, Trends, Privilege Exposed." Below it was a flood of comments, each one harsher than the last. "This is what entitlement looks like. She's been getting away with this for years. Time to clean house, starting with her." Her chest tightened as she scrolled further. A meme had already begun circulating, a freeze frame of her sneering face from the viral clip, captioned, "When reality checks your privilege mid-flight." Victoria's fingers fumbled as she tried to swipe the screen away, but the phone slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a loud clatter. The sound echoed through the press room, cutting through the hum of whispered conversations and scribbling pens. All eyes turned toward her. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Victoria bent down quickly to retrieve the phone, but her hands shook so badly that it took her 2 attempts to pick it up. Malcolm Hayes paused mid-sentence at the podium, his gaze flickering briefly toward Victoria in the back row. He didn't address her or acknowledge the disruption, but his calm composure remained unshaken. He continued speaking as if nothing had happened. "This isn't just about one person," Malcolm said firmly, his voice filling the room once more. "It's about dismantling a culture that allows entitlement to thrive unchecked." Victoria froze in her seat, clutching her phone tightly as Malcolm's words echoed in her ears. Her reflection in the darkened screen stared back at her, a woman unraveling under the weight of judgment she could no longer escape. The camera lingered on Victoria's trembling hands before cutting back to Malcolm, who stood tall and composed at the podium. The press room was empty now, the echoes of reporters' questions fading into silence. Malcolm Hayes stood backstage, his posture relaxed but his focus sharp. He was reviewing notes with one of his legal team members when he heard hesitant footsteps approaching. Victoria Langford appeared in the doorway, her oversized sunglasses pushed up onto her head, revealing red-rimmed eyes. Her movements were slow, almost timid as she stepped inside. She stopped a few feet away from Malcolm, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Malcolm looked up from his notes, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between them like a fragile thread. Victoria cleared her throat softly, her voice trembling as she spoke. I didn't mean for things to go this far," she began, barely able to meet Malcolm's gaze. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He set his notes down and folded his arms across his chest, his eyes fixed on Victoria with quiet intensity. "I didn't mean—" Victoria started again, but Malcolm cut her off with a single sharp look. "You never do," he said evenly, his tone carrying the weight of years of dismissal and humiliation. Victoria's shoulders sagged under the force of those 3 words. Her lips parted as if to say more, but no sound came out. She glanced down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she tightened her grip on her bag strap. Malcolm turned away without another word, walking toward the exit with deliberate strides that echoed softly against the walls. The camera lingered on Victoria's face, a mix of shame and desperation, as she stood frozen in place, unable to follow or respond. The silence that remained was louder than any apology could have. Ibn Victoria Langford stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing softly as she approached a full-length mirror mounted on the wall. The press room was far behind her now, but the weight of Malcolm Hayes's words lingered, heavy and unshakable. She stopped in front of the mirror and hesitated before looking up, The woman staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her makeup was smudged, her hair slightly disheveled, and her once pristine posture had crumbled into something slouched and defeated. Victoria reached up to adjust her sunglasses, but instead she pulled them off completely and let them dangle loosely in her hand. Her eyes locked onto her reflection, searching for the confident, composed woman she used to be. But all she saw was someone who had been stripped of the armor she had worn for years. Her privilege, her status, her untouchability. Outside, faint chants from protesters filtered through the walls. Justice now, equity always. Their voices were steady and relentless, growing louder with each passing moment. Victoria's gaze shifted to the edges of the mirror where the glass was slightly warped and cracked. Her reflection splintered into fragments, distorted pieces, of herself that no longer fit together. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the cold surface, as if trying to hold on to something solid. Her breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to push them back, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, as if refusing to let herself break any further. The chants outside grew louder. "Accountability starts here!" Victoria turned away from the mirror abruptly, unable to face herself any longer. She walked down the hallway with hurried steps, clutching her sunglasses tightly as though they could shield her from a world that no longer saw her the same way. The camera lingered on the fractured mirror for a moment before fading to black. The press room was packed once again, the energy palpable as reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised and cameras ready. Malcolm Hayes stood at the podium, his posture steady and composed. The murmurs from the crowd faded into silence. As he adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements deliberate. Victoria Langford wasn't in the room this time. She had left hours ago, but her absence didn't erase the weight of her actions. Her name still hung in the air, unspoken, but present in every question, every glance exchanged between reporters. Malcolm looked out at the crowd, his gaze calm but piercing. "For years," he began, his voice steady, "privilege has dictated who gets to feel like they belong. It's dictated who gets to speak, who gets to thrive, and who gets to be seen." The room was silent except for the faint hum of cameras recording every word. Malcolm paused briefly, letting his statement settle before continuing. "But equity isn't optional, it's essential." The words hung in the air like a verdict, silencing even the most skeptical reporters. A few exchanged glances, their pens moving furiously across notepads as they captured the moment. In living rooms across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens. On social media, clips of Malcolm's speech began circulating within minutes, accompanied by hashtags like equity, is essential, and justice in aviation. One reporter raised her hand hesitantly and asked, "Do you think this will lead to lasting change?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver as he replied firmly, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts here, with accountability and action." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the room and spilling out into the streets where protesters cheered in solidarity. Malcolm stepped back from the podium, his expression calm but resolute. The camera lingered on him for a moment before panning to the reporters scribbling furiously and activists chanting outside. The press room buzzed with energy as Malcolm Hayes stepped away from the podium, his words still reverberating in the minds of everyone present. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, their fingers flying across keyboards as cameras captured the aftermath of his powerful statement. In the crowd, a young activist leaned toward her friend, her voice barely above a whisper. "This changes everything," she said, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and determination. Nearby, a veteran reporter sat back in his chair, his notepad balanced on his knee. He tapped his pen thoughtfully against the paper before writing in bold letters, "A new era for aviation." Outside the building, the streets were alive with chants and cheers. Protesters held signs high above their heads, their voices echoing through the city. "Justice now." "Equity is essential." Privilege ends today. The camera panned across the crowd, capturing faces of all ages and backgrounds, students, parents, industry workers, united in their demand for change. A young boy sat on his father's shoulders, holding a handmade sign that read, "One day I'll fly too." Inside the press room, Malcolm stood near the exit, watching as reporters continued to work furiously. His legal team exchanged quiet words behind him, but Malcolm's focus remained on the energy in the room, the shift he had ignited. The applause from outside grew louder as Malcolm stepped out onto the street. Protesters turned toward him, their cheers rising to a crescendo as they spotted him. A woman in the crowd shouted, "Thank you!" and others echoed her sentiment. Malcolm nodded slightly, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't wave or speak. His presence alone was enough to inspire. The camera lingered on Malcolm as he walked through the crowd, their chants growing louder with each step he took. Justice now. Equity always. The scene faded to black as the voices continued to echo. The marble floors of the press building gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the hurried footsteps of reporters and staff. Victoria Langford's heels clicked frantically against the polished surface as she made her way toward the exit. Her movements were rushed, almost panicked, as she clutched her purse tightly against her side. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone she passed. The once familiar faces of colleagues and acquaintances now turned away from her without acknowledgement. A man she had shared drinks with at countless galas walked by without so much as a glance. A woman she had mentored years ago pretended to be engrossed in her phone, stepping aside to let Victoria pass without a word. Victoria's breathing grew shallow as she approached the glass doors leading out to the street. The faint sound of protesters chanting outside grew louder with each step she took. Justice now, equity always. Their voices were steady and relentless, carrying through the air like an indictment she couldn't escape. As she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand hovering over the handle. She glanced back over her shoulder at the bustling press room behind her, at the reporters scribbling furiously, at Malcolm Hayes standing tall and composed near the podium. For a moment, it felt like the world was moving on without her, leaving her behind in its wake. Victoria pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The chants hit her like a wave, their energy palpable as protesters held signs high above their heads. Accountability starts here. Privilege ends today. She walked quickly down the steps, her heels clicking against the concrete as she tried to disappear into the crowd. A janitor paused his sweeping to glance at her briefly before continuing his work, brushing away a discarded VIP access lanyard lying in her path. The camera lingered on Victoria's retreating figure as she disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only silence. The glow of the streetlights reflected off the windshield of Victoria Langford's car as she sat in the driver's seat, her hands resting limply on the steering wheel. The faint hum of her phone vibrating on the passenger seat broke the silence, but she didn't reach for it immediately. Finally, she picked it up, her thumb hesitating over the screen before unlocking it. The notifications were endless. Mentions, comments, articles, and hashtags that refused to fade. Equity as essential was trending globally, accompanied by clips of Malcolm Hayes' speech replaying on loop. She clicked on one video, her breath hitching as Malcolm's calm voice filled the car. Equity isn't optional, it's essential. The crowd in the clip erupted into applause, their cheers spilling out into the streets where protesters held signs and chanted in unison. Victoria scrolled down to the comments. This is what leadership looks like. Malcolm Hayes is changing the game. Privilege has no place in aviation anymore. Her chest tightened as she continued scrolling. The comments about her were harsher. Victoria Langford is exactly what's wrong with this system. She thought she was untouchable. Look at her now. Accountability starts here. Victoria locked her phone abruptly and tossed it onto the passenger seat. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the empty street ahead. The faint sound of protesters chanting still carried through the air, their voices relentless even as night fell. Justice now! Equity always! She exhaled shakily and turned off the car's engine. For years she had been at the center of every room, every conversation that mattered. Now she was alone, reduced to a name trending under hashtags that symbolized a movement, far bigger than herself. The camera lingered on Victoria's car as she sat motionless inside, her face illuminated only by the faint glow of her phone screen before it went dark.